Excited for what we're gonna talk about today? Well, I'm excited for who's talking today. How about that? Less of me and more of God today, in 38, not 39 and 40. Before we start, how are you all doing? If there's a word that can describe the last week for you, or a phrase or something God has said, what could that be? How can we encourage each other in what God has been doing throughout our week?
I think the word that would come to me is whirlwind.
Whirlwind, yeah.
And it was not a significant part of the reading, but it kind of put life in context a bit.
I was kind of musing about the whirlwind bit myself. The writer of Kings, when Elijah has this theophany on Horeb, makes a point of saying that God is not in the wind, and he's not in the earthquake, and he's not in the fire. You know, he's completely transcendent. But the poet here puts God in the whirlwind. So I thought that was an interesting contrast.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the whirlwind is symbolic of God demonstrating his power and might to the human. That was his first hint.
My word it was an enlightening week.
Can you say more?
In one way, it was because we had the pleasure of spending Friday evening and yesterday talking with people who are doing students here at Duke, engaged in so many different, could be life-changing projects and world-changing projects. So that was enlightening. I was enlightened that I'm coming to the end of the stewardship campaign, and we got it done.
Good, okay. Praise God. Praise God.
I guess the word for me would be humble, or
Humility.
the humbling of man, and all of God's speech here is well, to put it in the simple terms, is this is how little and small you are, man.
I think the word for me is overwhelmed in a positive sense. A year ago, I was overwhelmed by a lot of transition, a lot of questioning about why am I here, even though I have some agency in making that decision, but there's only so much agency you have, and you realize that sometimes, right? In a world that says we have all the agency, when I got here, I'm like, no, I'm gonna blame this on God because I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. To feeling a sense of overwhelm in God's goodness, evident goodness in my life, even though I'm still overwhelmed by some of the things of the transition, but overwhelmed by God's goodness and the opportunity to, similar to what you said, Bunny, engage with other students. I live in this tension of being a student, but having also been in service to students for so many years. So that tension of wanting to be in service to students or in service of students and connected with them, had some opportunities to do that. Just overwhelmed by God's goodness in bringing me here, and sustaining me. Where there were times where I felt like, I'm gonna run away. I need to get back to something that feels normal. I will be honest, this doesn't feel normal to me for a number of reasons. It feels abnormal, not in a bad way. It just feels different. So, I think this was one of those weeks where I felt overwhelmed by God's goodness, and overwhelmed by God's permission to rest. Literally at the end of the month, it's a long month, and then November 1st hits, and I slept in, and I slept in, and I slept in. And I don't do that often. So and I felt perfectly fine doing that. I think it was almost God's gift to me for a long, long month of October. Good, especially this being good for me and a love of mine, and being with you all, but also just a lot of work. a lot of work last month and a lot of processing and thoughts and things that I've shared. So yeah, I'm thankful for you all. I'm thankful to be here. I'm glad we're in November. I'm glad that fall's really starting to show itself. And I'm excited to hear what God has for us today. I'm going to be mindful of our time today because it's a full day at chapel. And maybe some of you also are doing some things in service. So just want to make sure that I respect your time. Um, Out of a whirlwind, out of the whirlwind. I think that was a fitting word, right? It has felt like the calm before the storm. What is God going to say? And what is God going to do? And in good fashion, I think we see the tenderness of God, but also the strength and power of God all at the same time. Depending on the angles by which you've come to know God or were formed by God, I think at every angle it can surprise you. If you experience God as a righteous judge that stamps down any form of questioning or any form of indignation, well, you were challenged by this, by God's speech. If you see God as one who lacks time and takes God's sweet time to do things, you also were challenged by this. If you are a biblical scholar like myself, are knowledgeable and think you got all the order right and how God does things, you were also challenged by what God said today. And the hope is, wherever angle that we come from, that likened to Job, the hope is that we are humbled at the end of the chapters. Uh, and maybe in some ways quieter than we were before. So I love the fact that through these 3 chapters, Job does not open his mouth till God finishes speaking. What wisdom, right? Let God speak. He's let you run your mouth for a while, and now God is speaking. Why don't we hear it, what God has to say?
My reaction to that is Job finally got something right.
Yeah, that's true. I thought a lot about the parental life for me. Like I was reflecting over like how I responded to my mom. I think my mom would say this. She's 2,000 miles away, so I don't think I'll get in trouble. But I was good with words growing up. Maybe that's evident. You can see now. I talk a lot, speak. Talk. I was good with words growing up, and maybe I was a little bit more emotionally moderate too. So that combination can fit really good when you're in an argument, right? Because I could be just like as moderate, but also really wordy and frustrate my mom. And so in those moments, I could imagine, my mom would present something to me, and she was right about it. I was misbehaving or whatnot. And I would try to like argue my way out of it. I don't know if I made any sense because I don't remember what I said. I was 12, 14, 9, whatever age. But I would exacerbate my mom sometimes with my words. And it was interesting. I look back on that now and I said, oh, how arrogant of me. Like there are moments. But I knew I had a skill and I knew I could like probably get her frustrated to the point where she didn't want to talk about it anymore. Like so, and in my mind, I won the argument, right? Like because we stopped talking, and that was the point. And it's opposite of Job, right? Like I think Job's humility shows up in his willingness to stop and his wisdom in that. My wisdom was not present in those moments at all because I denied the fact, and I think similar to what we're talking about today, the positionality of who I was in relationship to my mom. And so, yes, I might have been eloquent with words, but that did not change the positionality that I should have towards my mom as parent. And I think that's what we see today. There's a positionality, there's a reorientation of Job's positionality to God. Because even though we can question God, we can challenge God, and God allows us to come towards God with those same things, there is still positionality that we must not forget. And God brings that into play, right? Starting off with the dialogue that we start off today. Any other thoughts when we dive in? I love it. Verse 38 and 1. Then the Lord answered. The drama begins, right? Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And I just love that imagery because it has been a whirlwind of dialogue, questioning, pondering, frustration, and at the same time, and anchoring. Like Job has still been anchored as he's been frustrated, questioning. He did not leave God. This is the interesting paradigm, right? He hasn't left God, but he's certainly been railing against God, accusing God, because God has accused him. And now God speaks. Right? Starts off that verse. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, what? Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? We could have stopped right there. Job, repent, and let's move forward.
Now, was God talking to Job when he said that, or was he talking to Job's friend?
So this is
Job's friend,
yeah.
was the one that was talking, right?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because Elihu is talking. What do we do with this? I think it is both and. I think it is a cumulative effect of the talk and conversation between the friends that is still anchored within this same contemporary dialogue, right? This theological collapsing or misunderstanding. Job is not the one immediately preceding that chapter, and then we come in, and I think it is both directed, and I think it's also broadly rhetorical at the same time. So I think you're absolutely right on that. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge, dressed for action like a man? I will question you, and you make it known to me. And then from this point, we have a poetic prose of rhetorical question that is very godlike. First thought I thought about was Genesis, the fall. What does God do? What does he ask Adam?
What were you thinking?
Similar to that, yeah. Let's go to chapter. I just love this. Actually, I think we should go here. I want to go to, and I'll just read it. Verse 9, Genesis chapter 3. This is the first time we hear God ask a rhetorical question. At least it's recorded. But the Lord God, verse 9, Genesis chapter 3, called to Adam and said to him, where are you? And almost in this chapter, we're hearing the same thing, like, where are you? You've been asking these questions, but who are you, maybe, rather? And who are you in relationship to the ordered world that I've created? We start seeing this rhetorical questioning throughout. Verse 4, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Rhetorical question. That's a simple answer. You weren't here, Job. You didn't even exist. You weren't even a figment of any human imagination. Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know how. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? This is beautiful. Or laid its cornerstone, knowing that a cornerstone is the last piece that signifies the completion of that creative order. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb. When I make clouds its garments and thick darkness its swaddling band. We see this now, this notion that Job has been wrestling with, his friends have been wrestling with, this sense of understanding what the created order should be according to their paradigm. And God as creator centering what his paradigmatic created order is. God gets to order how things flow. He's setting that through this rhetorical mindset. Okay. Surprising Job in every piece. But what we see is there, through the calamity, Job and his friends have confronted a theological disorder in themselves. God is now speaking and again re-emphasizing God's eternal divine order by which calamity has to confront. God is not disordered when humanity confronts disorder. This is the dilemma and the polemic, right? That people at times, and this is the practical pastor in me, lose sight of God and fall away from God because they cannot measure up the disorder of their own lives in the world around them with a God who has created order, even if we can't see it. So now we have Yahweh, the Lord, described in our chapters, leaning in, standing toe to toe with Job, and not just Job, but with all who represent this kind of punitive, righteous theology that does not afford any form of disorder to any form of humanity, depending upon what they perceive as righteous and what they perceive as unrighteous. And God is centering God's self in the midst of this through this rhetorical, poetic prose to put the right ordering before Job, not to create something orderly. It had always been. So now we get this reemphasis, right? Job wanted court, right? He wanted to have court. He wanted to be presented, to defend himself. Right now, Job has no defense. It is God as judge and arbitrator, not judging in the way in which Job would have thought. Thoughts on that? The first piece. God leans in and says, where were you when I created the world? What kind of voice did you hear God speaking in when he said that?
Not exactly sarcastic, but or taunting. It's kind of like he's setting himself up to start a tirade.
Well, I think even Job, hearing this, could have recognized that the question was rhetorical.
Yep. It was almost, it didn't need an answer.
Or he wasn't looking for one.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a sense of awe that I think is assumed. Some of the theophanies that were talked about in our guide, right? They're typically when God reveals God's self, there's a sense of awe and a sense of pause. Right? There's a refrain between knowing God and then seeing God. And in some ways, the voice is almost like a scene. It creates a sense of awe, right? And not just to hear God's voice, like call you by name, but actually to hear God engage in dialogue. Really, right now, it's a monologue, but in dialogue with you. And so we see this sense of awe that is coming to Job. God, in one sense, does confront Job and is beginning that confrontation, particularly when it comes to God's creative work. And your guide gives some examples to how God is framing the creative order in relationship to God's own standing and power in creation that we see.
What about verse 8?
Yes, 38.
38,
Yeah.
I never heard the analogy of the sea bursting out from a womb. Is that, maybe it's elsewhere, but
Yeah, I think
I wonder what was the womb?
yeah, it feels like it's a paradigmatic type of play of words where like the breaking of water in birth is kind of this bursting forth of created culmination, right? Like the water in many ancient Near Eastern literature, particularly in the creative writings, water is seen as chaotic, right? Uncontained. And in one sense, God seems to be playing on the words of that God is so powerful that he can contain that which is seemingly chaotic. And so water in that sense, birth and birth pains in that sense, I can't describe that for, I always humble when I talk about birth. It's not something that I will ever experience, right? But this sense of chaos before the created good, right? The beauty of chaos and the creative framing of chaos. Water is embodied in that, both in the creative earthly sense and both in the creative humanly sense. So I think that's what the play is there. something that Job would understand as a person who has had children, or at least fathered children, and also zooming out for us, I think, when it comes to those things. You know, I think the beauty is that God speaks in a way that his creation can understand, right? Or at least draw into. Now, sometimes God will confound as actually a means of oneself towards it, as we find later on in the New Testament. Jesus confounds all the time. And God confounds through a biblical picture. But I think he's trying to paint a little bit of an imagery between that which is chaotic, but also is birthing. You know, but I think that's great, great.
Because it follows up with swaddling, so.
Yeah. So what does God accuse Job of? There is an accusation that God makes to Job, or makes of Job. God reverses a few things. Job has been pressing throughout these last few chapters. Make an accusation. Show me what I've done wrong. Prove what I've done wrong. And the simplest thing that God shows, right, that we start off with, and it's both in relationship to the conversations that have been had by his friends and also in relationship to him, is that you speak without knowledge. All this time, Job has been speaking with a presupposition in mind, that he has an understanding of God's theological order, God's creative order, God's view towards sin, God's view towards righteousness, and it doesn't align with who Job perceives himself to be. And also what everything around Job, apart from God, perceives him to be. Right? Job has been levying his righteousness, his giving to the poor, his care for society, all these things. God doesn't lean in and say, well, let me explain to you all these things. God says, I'm going to accuse you of one thing initially. You're ignorant. Yeah, whenever I've heard somebody say that, it feels very offensive and stinging, right? If somebody comes to me and says, you're ignorant, sometimes that feels like fighting words. But God leans in and says, hey, who are you? You're without knowledge. You don't understand the fullness of God's own mind. Hebrew word to know, to knowledge, to understand, or to discern, right? And so I think it's a good thing, like the contextual knowledge, the theological knowledge is not a holistic knowledge. Good example for us, good example for me, who lives in these places all the time, that studies. God challenges that because Job has a theological understanding. He's still ignorant in relationship to what God is presenting, in relationship to the dialogue in which, or rather the calamity or the unanswered solution to the calamity that Job has experienced. So the indictment is that Job is ignorant, first and foremost. He's ignorant of the wisdom that belongs chiefly to God and that God will display to Job in God's own time. And so he's ignorant of that. And as he draws on some of the wisdom school, I loved what our guide said on page 83. I think it was a great example. I'll read it. Counsel, knowledge, and discernment are all fundamental words to the vocabulary of Israel's wisdom tradition, to which we have seen the book of Job belongs. By focusing on Job's ignorance, God transforms the courtroom setting of Job's desire into a wisdom school, in which God is the teacher and Job is the student. The wisdom Job needs for understanding God's design for creation and by implication, his place in it, the divine teacher will provide over the course of this speech and the one following. With fear and trembling, Job summoned God the judge. He did, kept summoning him. But it is God the wisdom teacher who appears in the tempest. So there is a reordering where God is seen as supreme teacher, informing Job of that which Job was ignorant of. God gives reference to, in our book, God works through careful design and construction. We see this, a thing that was thought of for me in in chapter 38, when he talks about the careful measurements in this kind of poetic nature, the sinking of its deep bases, the laying its cornerstone, the divine architect and construction, and kind of levying against Job, this thing that you were not there as I created it, yet you marvel in this beauty. I think about Duke Chapel. So think we step into Duke Chapel, I marveled at it every single time. I look at the beauty of it, context of it. I can scrutinize it if I choose to. I can scrutinize the columns, the width, the breadth. I can scrutinize the chalice. I could talk about some of the things that are not made, some of the things I would suggest, but I can never ask the mind of the person who designed it. Can't ask Julian Abel, what were you thinking in this boat, unless it's recorded, unless I can read something and suggest what Julian has done. I have no perspective to form an opinion on how Julian wanted to design the place in which he designed. The only thing I can do, to a certain extent, is look at the time period in which Julian Abel was in and get some inference by some things that were included, some things that are no longer included because of the time frame and the place in which Julian Abel lived. But I can't search the mind of Julian Abel. And therefore, I can't form a full conclusion of the totality of that created structure. I could marvel at it. I could critique it. I'll never definitively be able to understand the full framing and construction of it. And Job is that. Job is sitting within the chapel that is God's created order and universe and bringing critique to the things that Job will never fully understand. And what God is kind of presenting is marvel in that which I have given you visibility to, and entrust me for that which I have not. So we see Job experiencing this as God is an architect, a master builder, and putting creation into its proper place. The language of darkness and light being presented as a fitting element of the edges of the earth and the created provision, signs. He goes from water and sea to the created order of the weather elements, rain and lightning, snow and hail, winter and summer, how God nurtures it, God protects it, God guides it. God brings vegetation. And then he talks about the animal world, right? And how the animal world in some ways is chaotic, and how we see both at the same time an orderliness to the animal world where some live so that some die rather so that some can live. This cyclical nature which God has created, and that which human beings participate in. God, I think God is highlighting in this, and I would love to hear your thoughts, particularly in creation. What the animal piece of creation, what did you see as an element that God is trying to uplift to Job in this dialogue about the order of animals and all those things that he brings about in chapter 39? If there was anything that was highlighted for you as you were walking through that. He starts out verse 1 with, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Starts about this like creative, the second layer of creative order, right? First, like the creative order of the natural world, creative order of mammals and animals.
It was just like point after point after point of things that God has done that we don't understand or we couldn't replicate ourselves.
It's almost concentric, right? So it's like the creative, how he's created animals, and then how he's created the creative forces of animals. He even talks about the ostrich laying their eggs. So even like this formative things like the agency of animals that I've created as well, and how they brew and how they nest and how they care and tend for their own um, how sometimes the trampling of animal life is present. Really, the only thing that isn't wild that God lists in chapter 39 is one of the horses, the war horses. But everything else kind of has a little bit of a movement to it, a wilderness experience to it, other than the horse itself.
Mhm.
I mean,
There's
even
an
now-
interesting note in the Jewish Bible I have where he's talking about these animal things. And I'll just read the note here. In verse 4, it says, return no more to their mothers. And it says, from the human perspective, this describes parental abandonment, a theme elaborated more extensively with the ostrich kind of abandoning their eggs. So God's almost saying, I set these animals free to be on their own. And poor Job kind of feels that he's been kind of abandoned too. So I thought it's just kind of an interesting note in the Jewish Bible here.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows some of those layers of, I think, the fallen chaos at times that impacts the world at large, right? A lot of times we think about the fall only in relationship to humanity, but even some of the chaotic sense of sin and its presentation, its disorderliness at times that God sees through all of creation.
I think God is talking and in this story here that Job's not seeing the big picture.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it than just you and humanity. There's all these creatures. But overall, though, to me, it's like coming at it from the wimpy human perspective is that at least I would think God is, oh, poor human, I have taken advantage of you and made you suffer because I wanted to prove a point. But there's none of that. And of course, I get it. I get the big story here, but the reason, to me, the reason Job is doing this question is because his faith has been damaged. He can't figure out what he was doing wrong that he was suffering all of this, because in their society, when you've suffered and you had adverse things happen to you because you did something wrong, at least that was belief. I don't know if that's entirely wrong, but there was no concession to the fact that basically that God had made a bet with another heavenly creature that Job could withstand all of the torment and still stay faithful to him. And Job I don't think Job questioned the fact that God was all powerful, but due to what happened to him, his faith got to questioning it. And naturally he started asking, why, Lord? But I get the story. I get the point of the whole Job story, God's narrative, his friend's narrative. I understand that. I understand the lesson that it's trying to hammer into us dense humans.
Yeah, I think that's great. The profundity, right, of like not knowing why you have to experience this. And the thought too, like, would Job's experience been different if he'd known how this whole conversation you looked it up started?
Yeah.
Could you imagine if Job knew that God was in one sense having this with his own created being, and then
Yeah, then
Yeah,
I would have a question of, well, I'm not gonna go that way.
That's an interesting thought, because when we're, get this succinctly, if we're down in that valley, we may not so much question our faith, but we or feel totally alone. But our faith gets us to the fact that we are confident, it's a fact that we're going to come to the other side. So does God always know that Job's going to come to the other side? even through all this. And he may have to teach him a thing or two, but he's gonna come to the other side and his faith's gonna come back. At least that's true for me.
Yeah.
You know, when times are tough and you just don't, you're just not there, your faith's still there. Latent perhaps, but it's there.
I think what you're uplifting is what we're continuing to see throughout is that faith is formative. It's not static, right? Like faith is not a epistemological cognitive ascent and therefore you arrive. I mean, that is being watershed throughout the entirety of what we've read, right? That faith in one sense is being formative. I know at times we talk about, particularly in current dialogue around theology, a deconstructive faith. I think sometimes that can be helpful for people to understand, but I think the reality of faith is malleable, but also stable at the same time, right? There's a foundation by which Job is working off of, right? Job does not throw out the foundation, I think, to what you're talking about, but the things that are built upon it are malleable, right, and are being constructed by God's own doing in ways that only God can do, because Job doesn't even know, in one sense, the reconstruction that's happening in his life. It's not a destruction, but it's a reconstruction in relationship to, I think, the experience that God has presented to Job. And zooming out, God presents to us, sometimes collectively, as we've talked about some of the world, global, societal suffering, polemics and struggles, and then individually, and sometimes both and, to address that which is both formative for the world at large and formative for those who pursue God, follow God. Those are the things of faith that are formative, right? And I think the whole text, the dialogue, is a formative conversation, right? And also the absence of God's voice is formative. So God is still doing something, right? The notion of, like, we haven't talked about that at large quite yet, but God is doing something by being quiet. God is now also doing something by speaking. God was continually doing something through the whole arc of the narrative. And Job doesn't necessarily know what that is. I think it's
I would be asking, what's the point of all this?
right.
What is the point?
Yeah. I think that's the question of the day for every human being. What's the point? I think even if we understand facets of it, I've been not trying to make Christological claims because I've been trying to stay really, really, really like in just a moment in time. But even the claim of Christ has profound implications. But then also you could ask the question, what's the point? Why couldn't God have done that in the garden? Why are we here in Job, which is thousands of years before Christ's appearing? Why do we have to go through this? Is a question of humanity in relationship to God that understands the full formative story beyond what we know. And the challenge, right, that I think is presented in these chapters is that we don't have a right to know till God chooses to let us know. God does not apologize for being quiet.
Yeah.
It says something, right? Yes.
Basically, the whole point is in 40 verse 2, he says, he who arraigns God must respond. So arraigns God, they're using legal language. God is basically saying, you have no standing to bring a case.
Yeah.
So, even now in our current court cases with the Supreme Court, they'll dismiss a case, not because it's right, not because it's wrong, but just because the plaintiff has no standing. And I kind of almost see the same thing here.
Yeah, I think that's great to put it in the legal language, Steve. Like there is no case, there is no true case against God, unless God wants to bring it. Yep. Go ahead. Steve.
The other thing about, what is the point? I mean, way back in chapter 3, God says to Satan, you had me destroy Job for no good reason. So, in a way, there is no point in the first place.
Yeah, I think I just wanna, I'll close there, but let's go to the inner dialogue that we're having. It's almost as if Job is sitting here with us, right? Because Job can say the same things, probably has said the same thing, names the same things. But what is Job's response at this point? God has dialogued, or God has really monologued, and we get to chapter 40. What does Job do? What does Job say?
He folds,
He
folds.
he folds. Okay. Yeah, he folds. What does that folding look like? At least in those first five verses of chapter 40.
This says it's time for me to shut up. I have nothing
Yes.
in response to that.
Right. I thought about it as like a reversal of what I talked about earlier about me as a child in relationship to my mom. There will come a point where my mom would say something in response to who I was, in relationship to the argument at hand that 9 times out of 10 I was at fault for. And she would just refrain, she would just restate and refrain the center of the impetus. And I would shut my mouth. I would cower my head a little bit. And I'd shake my head. Because everything that mom said was true of who I was. She wasn't indicting me. She was naming the thing that started the conversation to begin with. And it's almost like Job as a child eating to the all wise God. What can I say? And God has been gracious enough to let me run my mouth. And we don't actually have like the actual time that Job is running his mouth, right? It's been a long time according to chapters. And God has positioned God's self to take heed and listen, because God obviously has been listening. God is not passive. Everything that God is dialoguing with Job in this poetic form is building up to the thing that you mentioned, Dean. Like, you don't have a case. I'm graciously presenting the things that you've levied against me in a way that's formative for you. God doesn't get formed. God is. God may respond to us in relationship to our own formation, but God is who God is. God is not a created being being formed and made into God's image, right? And better reflecting the God's image. So we see God relating to this image bearer that has a malformed view of what that means to be a created being in the totality of God's story, whatever God's story is. And we'll get to pick that up in the second half of that next week. So thank you all. Thank you for your dialogue. Thank you, Dean, for your you are my Hebrew scholar here, my biblical scholar. Appreciate you. And look forward to being back with you all on next week. We're almost done.
Out of the Pipkins.
Yes. And we'll be enjoying this, and we'll be our little Thanksgiving gift. We'll wrap it up. So we have one extended week because of our time away last week. So we'll still finish through, and we'll finish on November 15th instead of the 9th. And then we'll be done for the fall. And by then, also, I'll have some thoughts on where we're going in the New Testament for spring. So excited for that. Thanks all. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. God bless you all. Onward to worship to Daniel. You.
Bernita, we have gone. It's great.